Hello there, so the new Osu Clients editor has finally begun development and I'm already hyped. Anyone who watched the latest coffee hour probably is too, for reasons we'll go over a bit more next week, but for now I wanted to talk about the main new thing we can already see in Lazer's non-functional editor screen, a waveform. Yes, the new editor features a waveform in its upper timeline, which in layman's terms is a visualization of audio. And while it doesn't exist yet, I can only assume this waveform will appear behind something akin to the editor's current timeline ticks, whereon objects are placed to the beat. Even though this isn't a new idea by any means, it's still great to see newly developed features put in place after waiting for however many years, with many more to come. So then, what exactly does this waveform addition mean for mapping? It's not a huge change, but it could potentially affect more than you may think, which is what I want to discuss in this video. Starting with the obvious, this is going to make just about everything involving the timeline easier to manage. Timing, for one, is something most brand new mappers struggle with. It's a process of finding a beats per minute value relative to a certain MP3's offset, and to someone unfamiliar with music, that's not always easy to grasp. I can't tell you how many times I've downloaded maps that use 120 BPM and an offset of 0 because those are the default values assigned to any read timing point. With a visual representation of where beats land though, it's easy enough to align timeline ticks with waveform peaks and produce a, well, maybe not perfect, but decently timed map. In the same vein, just about every type of mapper, new or old, struggles with the variable BPM timing. Not every song works with the one read timing point that lines up with every beat, which forces mappers to include timing points with slight variations in BPM to account for a musician's human error or intentional tempo shifts. Currently, timing these types of songs is stupidly slow. It requires listening to a part of a song, guessing a BPM value, listening again, adjusting, listening, adjusting, listening, adjusting, and so on. It's relying only on audio cues. With a waveform indicating where a beat lands though, it would be possible to simply find a BPM value that closely aligns with a waveform peak, then listen more closely for minor adjustments. If you haven't tried timing these songs, you may not know, but that would be a significant quality of life change for someone who doesn't want to waste any more time than necessary on timing. Hit sound optimization could easily head down the same road. It's also something that relies on listening to a sound in a song and then taking action accordingly, usually by replicating sounds in the song through external sound samples. For just about every ordinary song with percussion backing, I think waveforms are ideal. Not only do peaks show where sounds in a song are and therefore where to place hit sounds, but in some situations they can also show what hit sounds should be used. Sounds like nonsense, but I'm serious. Probably the most repetitive part of hit sounding for me is replicating a drum beat, more specifically using a bass drum sound effect for each bass kick and a snare drum one for each snare hit. A waveform essentially lets me see the difference between these two sounds. For example, this is a song I would hit sound in that previously described fashion. By zooming in on the waveform, I can see a clear pattern. Because bass kicks are all low frequency sounds and snare drums are all relatively high frequency sounds, each bass kick is a spread out wave, while each snare drum is a highly compressed wave. That's just how waveforms show sound frequencies, which isn't worth explaining, but yeah, if I wanted to, I could hit sound this song's drums accurately, based just on the frequency of fluctuation in waveforms. For other songs, this probably wouldn't be perfect, but it's still cool to think about the possibilities. It also helps that hit sounds will actually be visible in the timeline as well thanks to another new feature, though we can't really mess around with that since no object's here yet. And of course, the biggest benefit of a waveform in the timeline comes from the main use of a timeline, rhythm composition. You most likely thought of this on your own already, it's just too clear how useful it can be. With waveforms lining up with timeline ticks, anyone can see where to snap objects according to a song. Like, for example, irregular snapping is a hard thing for some people to figure out. It requires a lowering playback rate and listening closely to a distorted version of the song, which isn't always completely accurate and it's hard to hear with bad headphones. Given a waveform though, anyone can potentially see how to snap stuff like weird 1/12 guitar strums, then use low playback rates to confirm that rhythm. More importantly though, a waveform lets mappers see the strengths of individual sounds, and therefore simply how to arrange rhythms. This should be fairly obvious already. Strong sounds are important, you can see strong sounds through waveforms, so rhythm can be coordinated around that. This is something I've done a lot already, just manually through bookmarks. As a timeline reference on a few maps, I put bookmarks on every distinct sound in the song so I can more easily imagine what rhythms I could use. It's more helpful than you think actually. So that's useful, but I don't think that's all a waveform will benefit in regards to rhythm. I think just being able to visually explain all this stuff to new mappers will make learning to map a lot more realistic. Like, when I say you should map the most important sounds in the song here, an experienced mapper is capable of taking that feedback and applying it accordingly, but a new mapper might not be able to easily differentiate between what sounds are important and what sounds aren't just through listening. I suggest placing clickable objects in these places because they're stronger sounds, as shown by the waveform here. Feedback like this, on the other hand, may give new mappers an easier time grasping the basics of mapping, since a clear visual justification is easier to comprehend than a vague oral one. That same logic can then be applied to feedback about, say, slider velocity. Higher peaks use higher speeds and lower ones use lower, or spacing emphasis in the same way. Through the addition of a waveform, I think learning to map could be a lot easier than it is right now. But at the same time, it could lead people in the wrong direction. Look, I'm fully in support of the Waveform edition, but considering all the possibilities made me also take into account the potential downsides as well, which could essentially be summed up as over-reliance on waveforms to the point of not accurately following music. So imagine a scenario like this. Lazer's editor is complete, hooray, and you're a new mapper looking to start mapping. You take advice from just about everybody about prioritizing strong sounds and associate that with waveform peaks, as we just talked about. By learning to map under these circumstances, you might end up focusing on the waveform too much and ignoring lots of musical subtlety. Not everything important in a song looks most important in a waveform, and it's not always best to map the loudest sounds exclusively, so I could see this being an issue. Maybe that sounds like a stretch, but if you've been observing mapping for a while, you may think otherwise. This same sort of problem occurs in current mapping, but reliance on a waveform is instead reliance on a conventional timeline tick priority. Most songs are fairly similar in their composition. They could all be mapped with priority on the white ticks, mainly the big white one, less priority on the red ticks, and occasionally objects on blue ticks. That's just what songs are designed to support. This repetitiveness has influenced people in some cases to map these normal, expected timeline ticks, even when the song indicates importance elsewhere. I know that when I was new, this definitely influenced me. So many people told me white ticks were important so often that regardless of what a song was doing, I'd usually just focus on conventional rhythms. It was dumb for sure, but saying make the white ticks clickable was the easiest way modders could explain rhythm to a new mapper, since in a lot of cases, yeah, it is correct. So that's how I learned rhythm construction, and looking at tons of other maps makes me think other people may have fallen victim to this at some point as well. There's so many songs with occasional emphasis on irregular beats whose maps prioritize white ticks or other conventional rhythms anyway, and the best reason I can think of for why is because that's just what songs normally support. Anyway, I feel like using standard rhythms when a song accentuates non-standard rhythms is an issue I've seen too many times, and I imagine something extremely similar could come up with the introduction of an editor waveform. Like, rhythmically, this bit of mapping follows the vocals. This expresses the song fairly well in my opinion, but the waveform shows peaks of drums more clearly. I can already see new mappers thinking this is bad just because it goes against visual justification for prioritizing drums. And in the same way, waveforms aren't always ideal for comprehending timing. Different sounds have perceived peaks at different points in a waveform, so managing timing with a waveform alone will more than likely still end up incorrect. And most importantly, there's some songs where waveforms will be near useless. Ones where the importance of individual sounds are barely differentiable on a waveform, and so following it is going to be completely incorrect. You get why all this can be a problem by now. Following a waveform too closely can make a map less musically accurate. But still, don't let the negatives make you think that I consider waveforms to be a bad addition to the editor. They'll help me and just about every other mapper out there, as well as anyone aspiring to learn just the basics of mapping. There's way more benefits than problems, but everyone will need to remember that waveforms in mapping are no more than a reference tool, and should not be the sole basis for mapping decisions. The main basis for mapping needs to be what you hear, since that's all that's gonna matter when you're actually playing the map. Mappers of the current era won't have a problem with this. We're forced to use audio cues for everything already. The next mapping generations are the ones that might need to keep this in mind though. They'll have the convenience of waveforms, and reliance on that convenience isn't always the best choice. Anyway, that's about it. Small features can make a big difference to me, so I'm looking forward to whatever's next in line for Lazer's editor. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.